The UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is stretching the truth about NHS waiting lists to the absolute limit. He's recently made two claims. One, we're cutting waiting lists. Two, strikes are the reason why waiting lists are going up. So here's the spoiler. Taken in isolation, these two statements have an element of truth in them. But they're both so dishonest when seen in context. Let's take a look why. The waiting list is still increasing and hit a new high of 7.5 million in May 2023. If the PM had said we're cutting the waiting list, this would have been a lie. But he didn't say that. He said that we're cutting waiting lists. He's talking in the plural here. When the waiting list is broken down according to how long people have been on the list, you perhaps can talk about waiting lists when referring to the various categories. We can look at the trend of each of these categories. And there's something we can immediately notice here. For most of the period, there was only a relatively small number of people having to wait more than 1 year. Nobody was having to wait longer than 1.25 years. So the longest three categories didn't even exist. In the past couple of years, the fact that people are having to wait 1.5 years and even 2 years for treatment is just incredible. But of course, this must have had a lot to do with COVID, so the government isn't totally to blame for this. However, we can see here that the three other waiting lists have all been increasing, and this involves by far the bulk of the waiting list. Where there has been a fall in the longer categories, it involves relatively low numbers and, as I said, these were categories that didn't even exist before. The reduction in the three longer categories is most likely a correction that's naturally occurred after COVID. I'm not really sure that the government can take much credit for this. However, what Sunak effectively said was, we're reducing the waiting lists for people that have been waiting ridiculous amounts of time for treatment. This statement is true, but ridiculous at the same time. As to the second claim that strikes are the reason why the waiting list is still increasing, I listened back carefully to what Sunak said on the LBC interview. At one point he said the strike is a reason why the list is increasing, and at another point he said the reason. This is an important distinction, I think. To say it is a reason probably does have an element of truth to it. Treatments must have been postponed due to the strikes, and it is likely that this has had an effect on the waiting list. NHS England have published data suggesting that almost 700,000 appointments were cancelled as a result of the strikes up to July 2023. It's logical that this will have made the waiting lists worse. However, it can't be assumed that the waiting lists would have been 700,000 lower without the strikes. So to say it is the reason is not justified without more evidence, but it is at least conceivable that the waiting list would have fallen rather than increased if there hadn't been strikes. However, let's take another look at the waiting list. It should never have been allowed to get this high. To claim credit for reducing it is just embarrassing. The Conservatives came into power in 2010 and the waiting list has grown and grown to record levels. The strikes only started in late 2022, so absolutely are not responsible for most of this increase. Of course, Sunak personally wants to be able to claim that he's reduced waiting lists by the end of the year, and any reduction will meet his personal aim. This is his focus rather than actually trying to take any meaningful responsibility for the terrible state of the NHS waiting list. There's another point here. Doctors have effectively faced a pay cut of 26% since 2008. The 35% that the doctors are claiming is not a pay rise, but the restoration of pay to its 2008 level, taking into account inflation. The offer of 6% in this context is just derisory. I did a separate video a little while back on whether the pay claim of 35% is reasonable, and I conclude that it absolutely is, though I do also conclude that the 35% calculation is based on a less used measure of inflation and would be slightly lower than 35% if recalculated on a different price index. However, I feel certain that the doctors would agree on something less than 35% if there was a negotiation. But 6% is ridiculous, so I absolutely support the strike, even if it is increasing waiting lists in the short term. All indicators are that morale in the NHS is at an all-time low. Giving decent pay increases will improve retention of staff and improve productivity. This will actually reduce waiting lists. So is the Prime Minister a liar? No, because he's been careful to choose the right words. If you consider that there are multiple waiting lists, the three categories that should never have existed have fallen, but it's still a fact that the waiting list has increased. In relation to the strikes, it must be true that the cancellations due to the strikes have made the waiting list worse in the short term. But it's embarrassing to suggest in any way that the strikes are responsible for these ridiculously high waiting lists. And even if the strikes have made the waiting lists somewhat worse in the short run, pay restoration to 2008 levels is completely justified. I hope you found this information useful. If yes, I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time.